Hello, my name's Elaine Wilson. I'm here to talk to you today about the history of Russia. It's not the usual geopolitical talk because my background is not that. My background is art history. However, the talks are in preparation for better understanding some upcoming lectures I'll be giving on Russian artists. Well-known Russian artists, but maybe not well-known to everyone here in the United States. Before I start, let me say that again, if you are interested in some extra information about this series, which is in 3 parts, there are 2 pages that go with it. And if you want to make yourself feel good, take the second page and go down through it at some point and look at the questions that I ask for you to consider and how many of them you now can answer that perhaps maybe before the lecture series started you couldn't have answered as authentically as you can now. I'll add to that list today, and I'll certainly be finishing it up next week. Because I am dealing with the rulers of Russia, not all of them, but a number of them. I had written a book a while ago, and I still suggest it to you as a way for you to better understand not only the men and or the women that I discuss in this series, but also the people. And this book will address many of the personal lives of people who lived through or during the time of the USSR. And during that time, the rest of the world was blocked. We didn't know what was behind the Iron Curtain, and some of what we thought was true, but some of what we thought was true was not. So the book is in many ways an opportunity for you to get a better balance. I'll give you the address again about that and remind you at the end of the program. In the meantime, let's get started with the ethical and the evil and the ugly, part 2. Last week I gave you some areas for consideration, and you're going to get tired of seeing this list, but as long as it applies, I'll keep showing it to you. And if you notice on this list that this is the line that carries the names of the people that were the primary topics of conversation last week. Any of you who didn't see the program, it's on YouTube. You can take a look at it and then follow it up with the one that should be live by Thursday, and it will include others beside, but certainly the 3 Alexanders, Nicholas II, and I will get as far as Stalin, which means that during this program today, I will cover the entire 1800s because Alexander I became Tsar then. Up to this point, expansionism has been a part of Russia's history. Control at all levels was certainly a part of it. There was certainly in last week's program a tendency for the acceptance of megalomaniac leaders. We'll see how many of those pop up today. There was a lot of fear living under the times of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, or Catherine the Great as well. And the conviction that the strong make the rules. In other words, the conviction that whoever was in charge or will be in charge makes all the rules and you simply live by them. Here's Alexander. Alexander I. He is the oldest son of Paul. Paul is the only son of Peter III and Catherine the Great. Remember, she had him removed? And they have a daughter as well, but the daughter does not live very long. This is an idea of what Paul looked like. When Paul was 23 years old, when Alexander was 23 years old, his father, Paul, decided to have one evening a great dinner. And of course Alexander was there, and there was a plot afoot. And the plot included the representatives of Alexander, or the powers that be, were going to talk to Paul after the dinner and have him abdicate the throne. Now, what happens is a little bit more serious and convoluted than that. They wanted him to abdicate the throne, but they didn't really plan on killing him. However, that is exactly what happens. His son, Alexander, had said that you remember Paul played a soldier and had an affinity for Prussian soldiers and things like that. And his father, Alexander, was very embarrassed about this, and he said that Russia's just become a plaything for the insane. Well, when the conspirators followed Paul to his room, they gave him time to get in bed, I would imagine, and then they marched down the hall to his room with a copy of an abdication sheet that they wanted him to sign. Well, he heard them coming, so when that happened, he jumped out of bed and he ran over and he hid behind a curtain. So when the conspirators came in, the room was empty. And then they thought, okay, he's figured out something was afoot and he's left. Well, one of the conspirators went over and touched the bed where Paul had been laying, and it was still warm. So they knew he was in the room, and they looked around, and yes, sticking out from underneath the drapery was the Tsar, Paul I. They pulled him out, they showed him the paper. He refused to sign. One thing led to another, and depending upon whose account of what happened in that room that you read, Paul was either stabbed by one of them, and then that led to more attacks by the other conspirators because there was more than one in the room with them, or he was strangled. But one thing led to another, and Paul does not live. So now Alexander I will become the Tsar, and he takes that position in 1801. Alexander was very interested in protecting the culture of Russia. So one of the things that he does is he has all the schools purged of any foreign teachers that might be there. And he also was a flip-flopper, and you're going to find that they will continue. You even get as far as Gorbachev, and I'll mention it there. They flip-flop on their plans and their ideas of what they think should be done, and Alexander is certainly a primary example of that. It made working with him on an international or national scale very difficult. He created military colonies. He decided that it was a waste of money to have the military at the ready all the time, that they could go back home, they could live on their farmland, and most of them were from the serfs or the lower classes, and they could live with their family, and then 3 days a week they would conduct their military exercises, and the other 4 then were for them. That didn't work out too well. It was another unfortunate error that he made in the human spirit. People who get sent home from the military and only have to work 3 days a week at it get to the point where they value their family and their faith and what's around them much more than they do the military, and it caused trouble. It was not good. As he got older, he started to have some mental decline, and he also started to withdraw quite a bit from society. He became very religious. He became a very suspicious man. He will die of typhus. His wife is very ill, and they have decided to take a cruise, and the cruise will take them to a warmer southern part of Russia. And on the boat, he drank some water, and the water was contaminated, and he died. And about 2 months after he died, Alexander's wife also passed away, and they're buried at the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. Neither one of his younger brothers wanted to be Tsar. He had had 2 daughters, but they had both died. There is a brother in between, Nicholas I, who will become Tsar, and Alexander, and his name was Constantine. Constantine was in love with somebody from another part of Europe and didn't want to give up that relationship to become the Tsar of Russia. So last man standing was Nicholas I, so he had to take role. He had to take the role. I had mentioned last week that the Kremlin was originally surrounded by a moat and that a river still flows under it today. It was at the coronation of Alexander I that he had that moat filled in. So it's been filled in since 1801, and it is still filled in today. And yes, the river still does run underneath the Red Square. Nicholas I looks like this. Nicholas I is probably, of all of the Russian czars that I'll talk about, men and women, the most reactionary of them. He was a very hard-working man. He was a very strong-willed man. He was not very spiritual, but he also was not very intellectual. I can't say intelligent, but certainly in intellectual realms, he certainly was lacking a great deal. He will expand Russia's borders, which you've come to understand that just seems to be something that Russia does. He centralizes the government. Remember, that started way back with Ivan the Terrible, and it continues to tighten more and more as time goes on. And he encouraged some mass industrialization. Russia needed that. Peter had tried to move them forward. Catherine the Great had tried to move them forward, but there still was a need for more industrialization and use of the Russians who were not serfs and not living in the countryside, but residing in the cities to have meaningful work that would support the country. He did not like any dissension, and here's the reason why. The Decembrists thought that because there was this controversy between Constantine and Nicholas as to who would become the Tsar, that he was already a very weakened person, so they thought that they could overpower him, and I don't know what was going to happen next, because this was in 1825. Well, it didn't work. He was able to suppress the uprising, and he does become the Tsar. But dissension is something that he very much guards against. He insisted that the Russian people all speak Russian and be loyal to the Tsar. And along with Catherine the Great, who had started the settlement of Pale, where all of the Jews were restricted to living, he also will continue to mistreat the Jewish people. He centralized education. Remember, he didn't want his brother did not want foreign ideas. Well, he didn't either. And so he tries to get rid of those. When I was over there in 1988, they had centralized education. All the instructors worked from the same textbooks. All of them worked at the same rate of speed, depending upon what the topic was. Centralized education became a way back in the 1800s with the Russian people. Most of the men and women who were internationally recognized at that time really found that it was difficult to work with Nicholas I. So pretty much everyone agreed that domestically and internationally, he kind of failed at the role that he had been forced into taking. The one thing that I think is exciting about him is that he is the one that starts the first railway, 1837. The Russian railway system is very efficient today, and it crisscrosses the country, but it started with Nicholas I. Alexander II was born in 1818, and he was emperor from 1855 to 1881. This man does not have a happy ending. He is considered the liberator, though, and he will free the serfs, the poor serfs. They go from being transported to Siberia if whoever was in charge of them didn't like what they did that day, to being free to do whatever they want, to being restricted to not being able to move from one place to the other. It has just been, they've almost been like pawns on a chessboard. They just keep moving what rulers kept moving and continue to move whatever they think they can do with them. He is the one that sold Alaska to the USA. And the reason that Russia sold it to us in 1867, there was a lot of power coming out of Great Britain at that time, and they had a very, very powerful navy. And the Russians were concerned because Alaska was not attached to the continent of Asia, that it could become a point where Great Britain could move into Alaska, which meant moved into Russia, and then that would weaken his position. So he just got rid of it. He just sold it to us. Lucky us. Lucky us. We kept it. He forced Poland under stricter Russian rule. Poor Poland, it went from a country to part of a country to no country, and now finally back to a country again. But a lot of the Jewish people that came into the Russian country, it became Russian, came from the area that Russia had taken in northern Poland. There were a lot of Jewish people there. I thought you'd be surprised with this. 6 years of mandatory military service. That's very nice. He's liberating people. It had been 25 years. Can you imagine? You are conscripted and you are in the military for 25 years of your adult life. I don't know what you do after you get out, but I think that 6 years was certainly a much more civilized decision that he made. Now here's what happens to him. He's on his way back from a meeting one night, and he is passing along this canal. The church wasn't here, but he is passing along this canal, and all of a sudden there is an explosion outside his carriage, and he jumps out of the carriage to see what it can be, and of course it was somebody trying to assassinate him. And as he's standing there, he wants to talk to the man who was still on his feet. He had thrown the bomb close to the carriage. Another assassin that was with him threw another bomb. That bomb killed the man who threw it, and it also literally took the legs out from underneath Alexander II. There is a small area added to the side of this church, and it is in that area, and I'll show you in the next slide a picture of what happened inside, what it looks like inside this cathedral. This is where you would find the body of Tsar Alexander II. The cathedral, or the church, is called the Church on the Spilled Blood because it is. It actually sits on the pavement, the cobblestone road. This woman is standing here. The cobblestone road on which the carriage was that Alexander II was in was right here. And it literally runs right through the church. The cobblestone floor is the floor of the canal. And over here you can see, and over here you can see it again, this outcropping. When they built this church to recognize him, and it was paid for by the royal family, when they built this church, they added this little section that comes out into the canal and then back again on the other side to the width that the canal ordinarily is, so that they could accommodate his tomb, which is inside. This church is incredible. It's one of the probably one of the 2 churches in the world with the most mosaics, and they are absolutely beautiful. This is a Russian Orthodox church, and until the time of Alexander, after the time of Alexander and after it was built, it was used as such. But then along comes the revolution in 1917, and the churches become sites for ransacking by the Bolsheviks, and so the church is no longer operable. The Bolsheviks do a lot of damage, and then finally the USSR closes it completely in 1932. Unless the church was designated as a museum, most of the churches were bulldozed in. That became one of the problems with preserving St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square. And they finally were able to convince Stalin that it would be a great museum, and that, along with some other distractions, is what saved it. This one sat there, but it was used. This time it was used because it has a huge open area inside. It's not like St. Basil's. It has an open area for people to stand to worship. It was used as a morgue. Many people during the blockade, over 3 years that the Germans surrounded it was called Leningrad then. As long as when they surrounded the city, people just died. They died from hunger. Then there were also damages caused by the war. And so this was a place that if somebody didn't come home, somebody in the family would be elected to go over to the morgue and sort through who might have been brought in that day and see if the body of their loved one was there. Terrible, terrible time. And then after World War II, there was still famine, there was a need for food, and they needed a large warehouse where they could store potatoes, and so that's what they used it for. I went over there a number of times. As I said, my first trip was in 1988, and I had been to St. Petersburg a number of times. And so it was wonderful after 1997 that this building was finally opened. It had been draped and tented and carpeted and covered and mesh around it and fences and everything else, because it took a great deal of time, 27 years, to restore this wonderful church to its original glory. Today it does not function as a house of worship at all. It is listed as a museum, but it is a very important stop if you're going to go to St. Petersburg. Now we move ahead. Alexander II, when he was hit with the bomb, he was carried to the Winter Palace, and of course his son, Alexander III, was there. And they could do nothing for him. It was just hours until he died. And so now Alexander III becomes the new Tsar. And he will not die from an assassination, but you'll see that he does stop one. But he will die from kidney failure. He had a problem with his kidneys all of his life. If you remember, that was a big problem for Peter the Great as well. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll notice that he has his head turned in pretty much the same angle as he does over here. He had a cyst on one side of his nose that he didn't really think was attractive and didn't want people to remember him as having had. And so he always did a slight turn of his head when his portrait was done. In this picture, you also see his son, who will be the last Tsar. There's Nicholas I. So these are his brothers and sisters. Alexander III's older brother died in 1865. He was supposed to have been the Tsar, not Alexander III. Alexander III, knowing when his brother was still alive that he wouldn't have that responsibility, had fallen in love with a woman in another country and had actually asked his father, Alexander II, if he could have permission to go and ask her hand in marriage. And for some reason the father said, no, not right now. Which brings into the picture this woman. She's Danish. Her name was Dagmar. She'll become Maria when she marries him, because before the brother died, he had said to his father, he was engaged to Dagmar, He said to his father, whoever is the Tsar, please ask them to marry her. She's a wonderful person. So Alexander III, not in love at all, but keeping his promise to his brother and through his father, does marry this woman, and it turns out to be quite a lovely marriage for them. He is not as liberal as Alexander II. I'd like to think back and wonder what would have happened if Alexander II had continued, because he was lifting a lot of restrictions. He goes back and puts a lot of restrictions back on the peasants, which again is starting to sound like yesterday's newspaper, but he did it. But he is considered to be a peacemaker because during the years that he is the Tsar, there will not be any foreign wars that Russia's men are killed in. Here he is with Maria, Dagmar of Denmark. Here he is, this little tiny thing. And there he is with his head slightly tilted to the side. It turned out to be a good marriage for them. He was an interesting personality. He was different from his father, and certainly he would have been different or was different from his brother, who never became the Tsar. He was a huge man, and he didn't have a lot of refinement. He didn't think he was going to need it. The family didn't think that he was going to need a lot of education, and he was not being prepared for the Tsarship until it just was pushed upon him. Now, the Okhrana was a group, just like the Decembrists, that wanted to kill him. Everybody kept trying to kill the Tsars. One of the ones who was involved in this plot was Lenin's older brother. And he will stop the plot, but he will order Lenin's older brother hanged. And you'll see it will be Lenin who will order the murders of Alexander's son, Nicholas II, and his family. This man enjoyed the arts. Although he was lacking in refinement, he went to the theater and to the concerts, and he very much supported the arts. He was religious, and this is important. He was faithful to his wife. To this point, I have not been able to say that about any of the previous Tsars, none of them, including the women. They were not faithful. They would have children out of wedlock. This man is faithful. The picture that you saw before with him and his wife and the children, those are their children. And when he died, before he died, she was with him, and he said, even in life I have known an angel. And he felt he could go to rest in peace because he already knew what an angel would be like. As I mentioned, he kept Russia out of wars. He was very suspicious. He had the secret police. Remember, that was started with Ivan the Terrible and came and went, and sometimes more fiercely than others times. But the secret police were assigned to watch the schools and the universities to make sure nothing was being done that was anti-Russia. And he reversed many of the laws that his father had softened. As I said before, I wonder how Russia would be if Alexander II could have lived out a normal life. This man will take control of all the print media. The printing presses were started during Ivan the Terrible's time. Now, even private letters were subject to opening and suspicion and censorship. And along with everybody else, it seemed to have been in their genes, they continued to hate and to persecute the Jewish people. But he is the one who starts the Fabergé egg. He decides he loves her so much, he wants this gift to be hers for Easter. And the Russians give the egg as a symbol of rebirth, and they give these at the time of the Easter season. And he does that. He continues that tradition. His son, Nicholas II, will continue that same tradition. And he will give eggs to his mother and to his wife, Alexandria. Okay, things to look back on and just very quickly. Expanding the territory, oh yes, controls over everything and despising the Jews. Megalomaniac, hanged Lenin's brother. As I said, that kept Alexander alive, but it wasn't a good thing for Lenin to have remembered that the Tsars had done to his family. And instill more fear. Remember the secret police, they're back again, monitoring all the public facilities, the universities, and the schools, and also any correspondence and printing. Anything that had to be printed had to be approved, and it had to be pro-Russia. And a conviction that they were the strong ones, and they made the rules, and everybody else would have to abide by them. Now we come to Nicholas II, who is the last Tsar, the son of Alexander III. This is Nicholas with his wife Alexandria, who is British. Nicholas does not expect his father to die at such a young age, and he really was not a very strong ruler to begin with. He was more of an aristocrat. And he will rely on Dagmar of Denmark, Maria, which is his mother. He will rely on her for a lot of his political decisions. There he is with his family, Alexandria and Nicholas, and then the four daughters and their little son, Alexei. He assumed the reign at the age of 26, again, not because he was really prepared for it mentally, psychologically, really at all, but he assumed that. And he is crowned Tsar in 1894. He abdicates the throne in 1907. Now, he's not executed until July of 1918. By the time that the Bolsheviks, the proletariat, the people that organized the murder of this family, by the time they are doing this, he is a citizen. He is no longer the Tsar, but they have such pent-up anger that they kill him anyway. And it's one of those things that just, for me personally, doesn't make a lot of sense. But he was like the others that had come before him. All of them, every one of them, believed that God had chosen him and that his decisions had to stand. Remember, the strong make the orders. Now, there is a palace called the Alexander Palace, and it is south of St. Petersburg. And this will be where Nicholas II and his wife and the children will pretty much spend their time, rather than in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And the reason for that is because of all of the dissension in the country. Catherine the Great had this built for Alexander I. He really didn't want it. His wife didn't want it at all. She didn't like all the pomp and circumstance that went with having to live so close to the Catherine Palace, which is here, which is where Catherine the Great had her special place. This is an interesting building. This building has all kinds of parts to it. This part that I am just now circling, this is 16 rooms here, and those 16 rooms in that structure was the building that was constructed and given by Peter the Great to his wife, Catherine I. And then their daughter Elizabeth comes along and she extends the size of this. And then Catherine the Great comes along and she extends it even more. If you have been there, it is absolutely incredible. The grounds are just beautiful. If you ever have an opportunity to go there in the summer and have a picnic on the grounds or listen to some of the music that's being played in the conservatory that's there, it's really beautiful. But it is not a place that Alexander and his wife wanted to go to very often, but they had no choice. She was the Tsarina, and he and his wife had to do her bidding as well as everybody else. This is a painting by the man who did the one of Ivan the Terrible killing his son. This is Ilya Ripin. And the interesting part about this is when I mentioned the painting, or I showed you the painting done of Ivan the Terrible with his son, I mentioned that it was historically based. This is personally based. Ripon actually protested in this rally. Now, what's going on October the 17th in 1905 in St. Petersburg? We'll look at this. Great deal of unrest. Workers are unhappy. They're working, some of them are working 13-hour days. Some of them have no days off. Soldiers were very, very disgusted with the way their circumstances were. There were people who were picked up and imprisoned. I knew of some even in the 1980s. Imprisoned for no reason at all, except they happened to be where somebody was who had the authority and could cart them off. There were strikes everywhere. You can imagine, if the workers are unhappy, they're going to go on strike. And the farmers, and some of that was still made up from the serfs that are out there, it was really a very, very difficult, mutinous time. And so there were a lot of senseless killings that occurred at that time. And I will not be going into that today, but it's something you might want to consider taking a look at. One of the leaders said this, and I want you to notice the word soul. He said that Nicholas II was the sole murderer of the Russian Empire. He had killed the soul of the country. And that was the attitude of many of the Russians at that time. Nicholas promised that he would come back to St. Petersburg from his palace outside of the city, and that he would give them a voice and he would establish a Duma where they could come and talk. Well, that didn't go very well, and before it was all over, he dismissed everybody, and that was the end of that. And of course, that didn't lead to anything getting better. And it did lead to the Russian Revolution, which happens in 1922. One of the men that I'll be talking about in just a few minutes is Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was in St. Petersburg when this happened. And he is one of the ones who established a council. Soviet is the word, it's a word analogous to council. And he established the St. Petersburg Council, or Soviet. And that was really a warning of what was to come. But history displays that more than at that time. All right, I can't pass by Nicholas II without talking about Rasputin, because what happened is when Alexandria married Nicholas II, she had been the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, or was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And in that family line, there was hemophilia. And their son, Alexei, will become or will be born as a hemophiliac. And there is in the St. Petersburg area a Siberian monk who was not really all that clean or well taken care of, but he seemed to be able to schmooze and move and groove until he got to the point where he got the attention of the Empress. This is not a little man. Look, he's 6'4". But he will meet with her and he will tell her that he can advise them on what to do to cure Alexei's hemophilia. And at one point, Alexei got a very, very big hematoma on the top part of one of his legs. And she got in touch with him somehow or other, and he said he would be praying for her and whatever. And of course, miraculously, the bleeding did stop, so that just confirmed for everybody that he really was going to be a big help to the family. However, that doesn't go so well. Look at the year, 1916. I have been in this room. This is in the basement of the Yusupov Palace, which is along one of the canals in St. Petersburg. And this will be where Rasputin spends his last hours. They want, the powers that be are trying to get rid of the Tsar, but they also are trying to get rid of Rasputin and his antics. And so there are several of them get together, including the prince of this palace, and they invite him over. And the prince suggests that the two of them just go downstairs for a little bit of tea and cakes before the main meal. So they go down these steps, and It's not as grandiose as the main staircases up above, but you get down in there and there's this little room, and they had laced the tea and the cakes with cyanide. Interestingly enough, there are some of us folks here in this world, and I don't think I'm one of them, whose bodies have a chemistry makeup that keeps us from being reactive to cyanide. We might as well eat sugar. It doesn't bother us. So he ate the cakes and the tea and asks for more, and the man's eyes are bulging out. He can't believe that he's still alive. So he pulls out a gun and he shoots him. Well, when he shoots him, the concussion for that threw him onto the floor. And now the man, the prince, thinks he's dead. So he rushes upstairs and he tells this man, I've done it, he's dead. Let's get him out of here. Well, they go back downstairs and Rasputin has righted himself, and all 6'4" of him is standing up, ready to take them on. It took 2 more gunshots to down him again, 1 to the head. And then they wrap him in a cloth and they carry him to a bridge along the canal where the Yusufa Palace is, and they toss him over into the river. Now, it's December, so Rasputin's body breaks the ice, he goes under the ice, and they say that's the end of that. And what had happened in the meantime, they had left his coat and his hat upstairs, and they had one of their accomplices dress in the hat and the coat of Rasputin, hail a cab and go to Rasputin's home where he was staying. So it would look as though he had gone home and had just disappeared that way. Unbelievable things happen when people make plans that are not necessarily the best, and that's what happened. The police come along and they see blood on the railing. Well, there is blood there. The man's been shot 3 times, so even though they have him bundled up, there's still blood. Now they look over, and on top of the ice is a boot. So they know somebody has met an unbelievable fate. And they check down the river a little ways, and sure enough, it's the body of Rasputin. He is pulled out of the river, and one of the friends of Alexandria, Tsarina Alexandria, takes his body and has it buried. But it will not stay that way. Later, in 1917, this is the end of 1916, in 1917, they decide that they should, the powers that be decided that they should exhume the body of Rasputin and that they should burn it. So there would be no opportunity for people to try to use that as a site where they could go to mourn either his passing or the passing of the royal family, which is what we come to next. Here they are again, and this is the last place they live. They were murdered on the night of July the 17th in 1918, a year after he had abdicated the throne. They have been transported different places, and this site is in Yekaterinburg, and it's called the Impetiv House. It was built by a wealthy magnate at that time, so it is a very large property. The entrance to the property is over here. They will leave that entrance because a doctor, and they will come and go into this room down here, which is about 20 by 16. They will go into that room because the soldier comes to the doctor who is there with them. They have 4 attendants with them that are living with them at the palace. And they say to the doctor, the White Russians are coming. We need to do something about protecting the Tsar and his family. Get them up, get them dressed, and get them down into this place, and then we'll order carriages to take them away. Well, in the meantime, the girls and the Tsarina have all sewed a lot of their diamonds and good jewelry into their clothing. And then that's on the undergarments, and then they've covered that with the more wispy clothing on the top. So they are down in there. But they are in there, and the Bolsheviks will come, and under the order of Lenin, they will assassinate the entire family and the cook and the doctor and the lady in waiting and the footman. And this whole catastrophe will take 30 minutes. It took that long to kill all of them because the bullets kept bouncing off the diamonds that they were hitting on the clothing of the women. The Tsar and Alexei died the quickest, but the women, one of the daughters especially, it was very late, and they finally ended up stabbing at them. They had one they were carrying out, and she moved, and they realized she wasn't dead yet, and they had to stab her again. But they will only report, the Bolsheviks will only report that Nicholas II has died and that the family has been transported someplace else. And it won't be until 1922 until the public finally learns that the entire family was executed. And what they did is they loaded them in carriages and they took them out of town, and there was a field and a forest there and a muddy road, and they just dug up a site and they buried all except one of the daughters. I don't know which one. I think it was Olga and Alexei. They buried them second, and they buried them in a separate place. But nobody knows where they have been buried. Why didn't they leave? They wanted to. They knew there was going to be trouble. They were trying to get out. She was British. Lord Chamberlain had asked the king, King George, if he wouldn't offer them some kind of asylum, and King George was trying to play safe. He had no idea that the Bolsheviks were going to kill them. And so King George says no. So there was no asylum offered, and that was the last of the czars. So the Impetov House is the last czar's palace. And they finally had to build a fence around it because people, once they found out after 1922 that the whole family was gone, people started coming there and leaving flowers and gifts and notes just as a way of paying homage to them. And it will be Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin's in the army in 1977. I'll talk about him next week. But he is in charge of the men that the Bolsheviks and the proletariat decide they should destroy this house. And in one night, they take down the entire structure. And in Yeltsin's notes, it's interesting that later he would write, sooner or later, we'll be ashamed of this piece of barbarism. But it's curious that he would be the one who was responsible for ordering the men and overseeing them destroy the property. Today, the property is under here. There is the Cathedral on the Blood, which is the blood of the Tsar and the family, and it sits in Ekaterinburg on a site where the Impetov House had been. And curiously enough, Yeltsin built a museum to himself, and from his museum, you can see the church on the Blood. And this continues, even today, this continues to be a very popular pilgrimage site for many of the Russian Orthodox Christians. Now, what happens to Dagmar? Her husband was dead. He had died, and her son Nicholas is gone, and what's going to happen to her? Well, she was smart. She left immediately for Denmark, and she stayed there. And she died there. And it won't be until 2006 that the Danish royalty connect with Putin, and they exhume her body and bring it back to the Peter Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, where her husband is buried, and bury her beside him. Here's what happened to some of the people that Nicholas knew. 84 days go by, and 27 other friends and family members were murdered. It was a vicious time in history. Now we come to Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, the three Bolshevik leaders. I think this is interesting. Stalin is only 5'5". Lenin is only 5'5". Trotsky is 5'9". Those 4 inches don't do much for him because he is murdered by Stalin before it's all over, but they, along with four others, primarily four others, will establish the USSR December the 30th in 1922. And this will then usher in a whole new program for Russia. There are the three men. Trotsky was the intelligent one of all of them. He was a great orator and a deep thinker, and he actually was number two behind Lenin. Lenin had some very serious health issues, and shortly after he took over the control, he had some strokes, and finally he lost his speech. And through it all, he's married, and I'll show you a picture of his wife in a minute. He didn't trust Stalin at all. He just didn't trust him. And that's why he was leaning towards Trotsky as a backup for him. But Stalin knows all this. And Stalin will order Trotsky murdered. It will take 2 times before he finally does it, gets it done. But he wanted to be entirely in charge of the USSR. And when he saw the weakness and the death happened of this man, his next goal was to get rid of Trotsky. This is Lenin, painting of him in 2 photographs. He is considered the leader of the Communist Party and the Bolshevik Revolution, and he will be in charge from 1917 to 1924. This is a standard picture of him speaking. Always spoke, and he stood up high on something, and that was a motion that he made with his hand. And here he is, his whole right side is paralyzed, and again he loses his ability to speak. However, he did consider himself a man of destiny. He didn't appreciate anybody's point of view that was not his own. He was very interested in changing things as radically and as quickly as possible. And he never, ever gave up on his goal of making the USSR a socialist country. Women's Day started earlier than 1917. It actually started in the United States in New York City in around about 1907 or so by a woman who was Russian and had immigrated here. She decided that women needed more attention, but then it really picked up speed in the Soviet era, and here you see one of the posters that was done. The lettering on that, unless you can read Russian, says March 8th is the day of the rebellion of working women against kitchen slavery. And if you notice here, you've got the woman here who is freed. She's holding the flag and she's pulling on the hand of this woman who has been just, there's a samovar there and clothing and tables and all kinds of things from the kitchen, and she's being released by those while these women in the background march off to work. Because the communist socialists had a number of goals that they worked out, and one was that they wanted to weaken family units, which they did. They wanted the women to work outside the homes, and they did not want any religious practices. They were atheists, and everybody else was supposed to be the same. You could easily divorce whoever you were married to if you felt like it, but again, that was a way to weaken the family unit. And they legalized abortion, so no religion, no reason to honor the birth or the development of a child, so they legalized that. They also set up nurseries and youth pioneer and Komsomol camps. The youth pioneer for the smaller children, and the Komsomol camps were for the larger ones. And these camps were camps where the students would go, children would go after school, and this is where they would continue with their indoctrination of the socialist ideals. Lenin had said this one time. He believed that if he had a child for 4 years, the child would think the way he did. And for many years, that seemed to have been the case. There he is, and there is Nastya. There is his wife. His wife is an educator. I want you to notice something about this. During the time that he is in charge, 1918 to 1920, look at this. 7 million people died of starvation. This country, with all this land for agriculture, all this space, it was just not surviving, not caring for itself. And people who lived in the cities, half of the population of St. Petersburg and Moscow moved out into the rural areas during that time frame. Why? Because the families needed food and they realized they were going to have to grow and make their own. There was nothing for them to do except that. Now, what do these two have in common? Not so much love, but certainly the Bolshevik ideology, and she was also an atheist. And the goal was that the people of Russia would ultimately worship Lenin, not religious practices. There would be no acceptance of those. Nastya, with her educational background, was interested in libraries and setting up new libraries with more books in them, and she also was the one who started the pioneer in the Komsomol movements. She would die when she's 70 years old, so she lives a lot longer than Lenin. And she does live. Stalin is afraid of her because he knows she knows everything. And towards the end of Lenin's life, she was writing his letters for him. She was taking care of the business that needed to be done. So he couldn't get rid of her. However, he finds out that she has an appendicitis attack. He sends 2 of his men to go and see what her condition is. And when they report back that yes, that's the case, then she needs a medical doctor and an operation, he denies that request. And so she dies. And she is put in a tomb, she's cremated, and she's put in a tomb in the Kremlin wall near where the Lenin tomb will be. And I'm sure she was just furious if she could have done anything about it, but by that time she was just ashes. He is the one who makes this big state affair out of carrying her ashes to the vault in 1939 and have them interred. And you know what was going on in his mind had nothing to do with honoring her. It had to do with getting rid of her. He is also the one who starts the idea for the mausoleum in Red Square, and he makes it big enough. They don't say anything at the time. He makes it big enough so he eventually could put himself in there. But they put Lenin in there, and then they try to make a saint out of him. And at that time, till the turn of the century, the portraits and the sculptures of him were still everywhere. They now have a large sculpture garden outside of Moscow where they have put a lot of the sculptures that were taken from the railway stations and the schools and the libraries and the fronts of desks and classrooms, etc., because everybody was supposed to worship this man and then stand in line whenever they could to view his body. I've done that. Sometimes he looks like he needs dusted off. Sometimes he looks like he's just had a facelift. They're still trying to keep him presentable for people to look at. He said this, Lenin said, the end always justifies the means. And remember I said Trotsky was the intelligent one, and he said, if the end is justifiable. And of course, that's questionable. Here's the large sculpture that I see a number of times. It's when you get off one of the main metros right in the middle of Moscow. This huge statue of Lenin is there, and it's not the only one. And here's the woman, the victory woman above, and all of the workers down here below. Certain times of the year, people come and put flowers there. I put this one over here because it just makes me feel good to see that bird sitting on the top of his head, because I don't think he did the country much good personally. Okay, he said this, the lie, if it's told enough, often enough, becomes the truth. You have to watch that, folks, even in today's world. Always seek the truth, always seek opinions from various sources. And I find it extremely interesting that this little 5'5" man would cast such a long and definitive shadow across the country of Russia for so many years. Very quickly, before I finish, let me say a few words about this man. It's Trotsky. This is his original given name. He's Jewish. He took this name, and then his jailer, one of the times he was imprisoned in Siberia, his last name was Trotsky, so he took that as his last name. This is his birth, and this is his death dates. And there he is, standing someplace, speaking. Very, very accomplished orator. Did many things to organize the Soviet system, organized the army, the naval, the military operations. He is the one we have to look at and say, okay, you started it. The concentration camps, the gulags, the labor camps, all of those were started with his supervision. He centralized the trade unions, so there was only one. Everybody worked for the state. Everybody worked for the same goal. He said, though, that rules should be collective, so he wanted people together, his Soviets, his council, his groups. Stalin will disagree. He wants totalitarianism. He was chosen to be Lenin's choice if something happened to Lenin, but Stalin works against that. Now, he was not a big fan of Stalin's. Look what he says about the mausoleum. He said, "It was built on Red Square, a monument unbecoming and offensive to the revolutionary consciousness of this country." So he did not approve of that. One thing leads to another, and Stalin keeps knocking one pin out from underneath him after another until finally it is agreed by the powers that be that Trotsky should be expelled. He's expelled in 1929. He doesn't die until 1940. He spends his time living in a number of different countries, including New York City here in the United States. This is one of the things that he said that I find interesting. A sledgehammer breaks glass, but it forges steel. This is one of the areas of his home when he's living in Mexico City, and this is his desk and office area. And it will be on one of the mornings that he goes in there to sit down to work that he never actually gets up and walks out again as a normal person. He's carried out, he dies in a hospital, but this is what happens to him. There was a Spaniard living in Mexico who was Stalinistic in his thoughts and ideals, and he was able to be convinced that he should be the one to kill Trotsky. Stalin had tried earlier with 3 men with machine guns that pelted the front of this building, but they didn't do enough damage, and they certainly didn't do any damage to Trotsky. But this one will. The man comes in, the man comes to the door, and because everybody knew him, he worked there part-time, and he has a trench coat with him, and he has a paper in his other hand and the trench coat over his arm, and he said to whoever's guarding the door of Trotsky's office, "I'd like to see him, I have this paper for him." Well, okay. So they open the door and they let him in. He hands Trotsky the paper. Trotsky's sitting here, he looks down at the paper, and the man reaches underneath his trench coat, pulls out an ice pick and starts stabbing him. Trotsky is not immediately killed, but he certainly does make a lot of noise, and there's a scuffle, and people come in, and they of course collect him, because he's not badly damaged, but they take him to the hospital. But this is what happens. Trotsky says before he died, "I won't survive this. Stalin has finally done what he tried to do before." And most definitely, he did. There were many victims in Stalin's purgings. This is an early photograph of Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev. Now, Trotsky will live beyond the lives. He lives to 1940. These two don't fare quite so well. In 1936, Stalin wants to get rid of them because the 3 of them have kind of work together at times. So he wants to get rid of these two. He'll get rid of him too, but he wants to get rid of these two. They're right there in Moscow. So he has crimes charged to them, and he said they're false, but that won't matter. He said, you just go ahead with the trial, and when it's over, he said they'll put you in jail, and then I'll sign papers to release you, and you'll be back out and you'll be free. Keep in mind, they're working with Stalin, and Stalin promised to save them never happened. The night that they are put in jail, the first night, the firing squad comes to their cell door to get them. This man gets up to go peacefully. This man puts up a heck of a fight. They finally have to drag him to another empty cell, and they shoot him right there. And this man has said to him, take it like a man. And he got up, straightened himself up, walked out, stood in front of the firing wall line, and was shot to death. So that's how Stalin treated people, even people that had their confidence in him. This is Stalin. His name is here, but he calls himself this. This is him as a young man. He chose the name Stalin because it means steel, and as I said earlier, he wanted total totalitarianism. That's how he was going to rule. He intended that the entire population, it didn't matter what you did or didn't do, you would all work for the state, every single person, which meant that you work for him. He took over the collective farms, which turned out to be a real disaster, and he said there are no longer any private ownership. Everything belongs to the state. We will manage it all. He has 2 wives. His first wife is on a train coming back from someplace to Moscow to him, and they got along okay. And she drinks some tainted water, and she, like Alexander I, dies of typhus. And that was in 1907. And then he will marry Nadia. He and Nadia go to a party one night, and there are maybe 10 other couples there, and Stalin always has his eye out for something cute and interesting, and so he is defaming his wife and making passes at some of the wives of some of the other men, and because it's Stalin, the other men are powerless. They are not going to do anything. They just leave Stalin do what Stalin wants to do. Well, this so incensed her, and she was so embarrassed that when she saw her opportunity, she left the party with some kind of an excuse and walked home and shot herself in the head. And this man, he never went to her grave. He never spoke about her again. It is as though she had never, ever been a part of his life. He will have 2 sons and a daughter. One son electrocutes himself intentionally, and another son served in the Second World War, and then when he gets out, one thing leads to another, and he becomes an alcoholic and then a public nuisance, and he's finally put in prison, and he's in such physical disrepair that he dies. The daughter, Svetlana, will be there when Stalin actually dies, which I'll talk about next week, but she will eventually defect to the United States, and she lived for a number of years on the West Coast. Here we go again, folks. It's the same old list: expansionism, control, megalomaniac, fear, and strength. And what has changed? So far, only the names and the faces, but the objectives are still the same. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch with Ask Presenter at willowvalley.org, or you can get in touch with me. A number of you do that. And next week, I will be talking about these 6 men specifically: Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin. And I will also be discussing different aspects of what they did or didn't contribute to the quality of life in the Soviet Union, because this will be, Yeltsin is the first elected president, and this this area is where you have the dissolution of the USSR. So we'll be discussing a lot of those things next week. In the meantime, if you want the handouts, I showed those to you at the beginning. Please don't hesitate to ask for them. And if you're interested in the book, Pulling Back the Curtain on Russia, it's here, it's available. I don't have it with me, except my own copy. But if you go to Amazon.com, in no time at all, you'll have it in your hand. And it does give you an opportunity to see specifically with these 6 men whose names I just mentioned, to give you an idea as to how they lived. Not these men, but the people that they were supposed to be supporting of, and maybe not so much. Anyway, there are good things and bad things about everybody, and so I come prepared to share some of both, because as I've said before, I am first and foremost an American, no matter what. But I have been to Russia a number of times, and I care very much about the Russian people, and I care about the country. So under no circumstances am I going to defame them at the expense of anything that I think or believe. In the meantime, until I see you next Tuesday at 10:30, stay safe, be happy, and God bless. Thank you.